Recently, I reacted to a video that was called How the USA Makes Britain Look Like a Village. It was a very interesting video just to see the sheer size of the USA, especially when compared to the UK, which really did look like a village in comparison, smaller than a lot of US states. And on that video, someone recommended this one along a similar line. It's called How Big is the USA Actually? So yeah, I'm really enjoying finding out about the geography of the USA.
This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics to try out one of their premium plans right now. The United States is currently the world's sole superpower with military installations around the world. As a country, its geography spans from subtropical forests to rolling plains, scorching deserts, and Arctic wastes. But just how big is the US really in comparison to the rest of the world? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today, we're taking a look at how big the US really is. The US is approximately 5,680,000 square miles, with terrain that varies dramatically. Only Russia at 10.6 million square miles and Canada at 6,205,000 square miles are larger than the US.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in itself that Canada and USA, two of the biggest countries by landmass, are right beside each other. It seems daunting enough to want to travel around the USA, like from one side to the other, if you were to visit there, even if you live there. But never mind just visiting your neighbour, whether going from US to Canada, Canada to the US, and trying to travel around there as well. That's a lifetime of travel trying to explore both of those countries. Tell me if you're from the USA, if you went to Canada, if you're from Canada, do you travel to US? What's your favourite part of each place?
Its three biggest states, Alaska at 663,000 square miles, Texas at 270,000 square miles, and California at 160,000 square miles, combined would be the 17th largest nation in the world, immediately after Sudan at 1.15 million square miles.
Whoa, that's a kind of mind-blowing stat. 3 states are bigger than most countries. Only 16 countries bigger in the world than those 3 states. Again, as I mentioned on that previous video, I'm genuinely interested in learning more about Alaska. That seems like a very interesting place. Love to hear people's thoughts on Alaska, what's interesting about it, anything unique. And yeah, already we can see how huge the USA is.
And right before Libya at 1 million square miles. In total, the US is larger than the 107 smallest countries in the world combined. With about 327 million people, the United States is also the 3rd most populated nation on Earth, having a total of 4.28% of the total world population. With a net yearly migration rate of approximately 900,000 people, the US is by far the one place the rest of the world wants to live, with Germany coming in second at 350,000 migrants, and Turkey in third with 325,000 migrants.
I actually thought that places like Australia, Canada would also be up there, but I guess they just have much lower populations to begin with. That's probably why the amount of people going there isn't as high. But a yearly migration of almost 1 million people is absolutely huge, really, when you look at the other very populated countries, India, Nigeria, China. A lot of people don't really want to move to those countries, or it's not as in demand to move there as moving to the USA. How do you feel about immigration in the USA if you're from America? Do you think it should be higher, lower? Do you think this is just right? What do you think about the immigration crisis at the moment when you see all these people, undocumented, illegal immigrants coming to the country? Does it scare you? Is it like not as big of a problem as the media makes out? What's your opinion on it?
In the US, 83% of the population lives in cities, with its 3 most populated cities being New York City with 8.5 million people, Los Angeles with 4 million people, and Chicago with 2.7 million people. All combined, the population of the US's 3 biggest cities is equal to the population of Chad with 14.5 million people. Just these three cities alone are also more populated than Cuba with 11.5 million people, Belgium with 11.3 million people, and Greece with 11.2 million people.
Wow.
When counting the greater metropolitan area, New York City is the 10th largest city in the world, with a total population of 18.6 million people, just behind Cairo with 18.8 million people, and just ahead of Dhaka with 17.6 million people. This would make the greater New York City area the 63rd largest country in the world, just ahead of Syria with 18 million people.
Yeah, tell me if you're from New York in that greater metropolitan area. 18 million people. I've lived in Shanghai before, and that's a huge city as well, very, very populated. But do you feel like it's heavily populated when you live in New York? Is it only really the sort of main downtown, sort of main part of New York that feels heavily populated? I guess there's a lot of smaller towns in the greater New York state that are not so populated. How do you feel actually living there? When I compare it to my home country, Scotland, which is a population of 5.5 million, like the greater New York area is 3 times as much as the whole population of my country. That's just insane, really.
The U.S. is the world's largest economy with a gross domestic product of $20.4 trillion, or 23.3% of the total global economy.
Wow,
China
okay.
is just behind the U.S. at $14 trillion and 16.1% of the total global economy. When measured by purchasing power parity, or the price of goods and services versus individual incomes, the U.S. comes at number 2 to China, whose GDP PPP is $25.2 trillion. This means that while the Chinese economy is about 30% smaller than the US's, Chinese individuals have on average 20% greater purchasing power in their own country.
What's the reason for that? Tell me if anything can be done to change that around. And do people in America, do you fear China's power, the strength of their economy? I think probably in China there's still a lot more people living in poverty, and outside the big cities life is probably not great. But how do you compare USA and China? Are they like a rival for the world superpower?
The 3 biggest economies within the U.S. states are California with a GDP of $2.6 trillion, Texas with a GDP of $1.6 trillion, and New York with a GDP of $1.5 trillion. Altogether, these 3 states would be the world's 3rd largest economy, just ahead of Japan with a GDP of $5 trillion.
So
California's
powerful.
economy alone is as big as the United Kingdom's, Texas's is as big as Canada's, and New York's is as big as South Korea's. The United States also has the best equipped military in the world, though it's only the 3rd largest at 1,282,000 active duty personnel. Ahead of it are India with 1.4 million active duty personnel and China with 2.1 million active duty personnel.
Yeah, I think the thing with that, even though the American military, maybe by numbers of active soldiers or professionals, is maybe less than India and China, they're definitely far better equipped, far better trained, and just a better force overall by far, I would say.
The U.S. spends over $610 billion on its military every year, or 3.1% of its total GDP, 35% of the world's total military expenditure, and more than the next 9 nations combined. Just behind it are China with $150 billion in expenditures and Saudi Arabia with $76 billion in expenditures. The United States also has the most military bases in the most foreign countries in the world, with approximately 800 military installations in 80 countries, possibly more military bases in more foreign lands than any nation or empire in history. The cost of maintaining these bases alone is about $156 billion, more than China spends on its entire military.
Oh, I had no idea about that. I knew they had bases in other countries, of course, but I didn't know it was so far reaching and having so much money put into it as well, bigger than China's whole budget for military. That's quite amazing. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a great positive, not just for America, but for the world, to have these bases around? And I guess it just makes the world a bit more of a secure place.
On the civilian side, the U.S. has the world's 3rd largest police force, with 913,000 total police officers, placing it just behind India at number 1 with 1.9 million police officers, and China with 1.6 million police officers. In the realm of healthcare, the US is the most expensive nation on earth, with a health expenditure per capita of $10,350, placing it ahead of Switzerland at $7,900 and Germany at $5,550. While on average the rest of the world spends about 10.3% of its GDP on healthcare, the US spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare.
Wow, I never knew that. Those last two are quite, I guess you could say in a way, controversial subjects when it comes to the USA for police and healthcare. Tell me what your general thoughts are on both. Both seem to get quite a negative outlook on kind of mainstream media and things like that. Tell me how it is actually being in America, both of those things.
The United States is a large, complex nation, big enough to host several different distinct accents within its own borders. Its people are hardworking and industrious, leading the world's economy. But despite what recent political events might indicate, they're also the most welcoming nation in the world. With 3 times the number of immigrants, the nation's in either the number 2 or number 3 spot in a global comparison.
The US isn't the only welcoming place in the world. We've never felt more welcomed than when we signed up with Wix to build a website. Regardless of what exactly your business or hobby is, one thing's for sure.
So yeah, interesting video there. Like, I guess I was expecting it to be like, how big is the USA actually based on geography, but when you just hear how equipped the USA is in pretty much every area, it's quite magnificent, really. Tell me if you're happy with everything in the USA, how your budget is allocated. Do you think it should be better spent rather than spending so much on military, and do you think it should be spent in any other areas? Do you think more should be spent on military, especially with like rising tensions around the world and things like that? But tell me what you think about this documentary and what you found interesting about it. Thanks.